In 1965, Ford created an engine so tough it could run for hundreds of thousands of miles with little more than cheap oil and sheer determination. It wasn't fancy and it wasn't fast, but it refused to die. They called it the workhorse. Mechanics nicknamed it God's Anvil. What Ford's executives didn't realize at the time was that this simple inline six would become one of the most legendary power plants in automotive history, and one of Ford's biggest internal controversies. This is the story of the engine that changed everything, and the one they tried to bury. It all began in 1964. Inside Ford's boardroom, tensions were high. The air was thick with cigar smoke, and the walls were lined with charts showing months of declining sales. Chevrolet's trucks were dominating the market, and Ford dealers were getting restless. The executives, men in tailored suits with polished shoes, had one solution: build another flashy V8, the kind that looked good under showroom lights and appealed to the upper class. But one engineer sitting at the back of the room had a different idea. His name was Chase Morsi Jr., a hands-on problem solver who smelled of gasoline and carried the scars of real work. He wasn't thinking about prestige, he was thinking about practicality. Farmers, ranchers, and contractors didn't need luxury. They needed reliability. Morsi leaned forward and made his case: if you want to win, build something simple, cheap, and unbreakable. The room went quiet, then came the laughter. The V8 loyalists mocked him, calling his proposal peasant engineering. But Morsi didn't flinch. Outside the boardroom, away from the polished floors and suits, he quietly began his rebellion. In a modest workshop with bare concrete floors and flickering fluorescent lights, he gathered a small team of loyal engineers. On the wall above their benches, they taped a single sheet of paper with their mission written on it. Make it run on mud. Make it outlive the truck. Morsi's vision was brought to life by another unsung genius, Carl Renville. Working from Ford's Cleveland engine plant, Renville and his crew built something truly remarkable. The design was simple but overbuilt to survive anything. 7 main bearings, a forged steel crankshaft, and a heavy cast iron block so strong you could drop it from a barn loft and still bolt it back in. The long stroke gave it torque by the bucket load, and the low revs meant it could run forever without strain. During testing, they pushed it to the extreme, running it wide open for 300 hours straight. They tried to make it seize, they tried to make it fail. It simply wouldn't break. Every choice in its design screamed durability. No chrome, no aluminum, no showmanship, just raw strength. It was made to pull, to haul, to work, not to impress. They overloaded it, overheated it, ran it dry, and it kept on running. Meanwhile, Ford's upper management dismissed the project, insisting that trucks are about comfort now. They thought farmers wanted plush seats and power steering. But down in the trenches, Morsi and his team knew the truth. They weren't building a showpiece, they were building a survivor. Mechanics who later worked on it had stories that bordered on myth. One called it God's Anvil, the thing he'd used to forge other engines on. Another swore he saw one run for 20 minutes with no oil pressure, its bearings welded to the crankshaft, and the owner still asked the shop to fix it and send him back on the road. That was the kind of reputation the Ford 300 built for itself. But what started as a farm and work truck engine wouldn't stay confined to the fields for long. Soon, a new kind of mechanic, rebellious, creative, and fearless, saw potential where others saw simplicity. Guys like Mad Mike Davidson looked at that cast iron 6-cylinder and didn't see a tractor motor. They saw a challenge, a sleeping beast waiting to be unleashed. From the factory, the 300 made a modest 122 horsepower, not exactly intimidating. But with Davidson's touch, it transformed. He ripped out the single carburetor and replaced it with twin 4 barrels on a custom intake manifold. It was something you'd expect to see on a 426 Hemi, not an inline 6. He upgraded the camshaft for higher lift and longer duration, added free-flowing headers, and built a custom ignition system that turned every spark into thunder. The result was staggering: 328 horsepower and over 400 lb-ft of torque. Suddenly, this so-called farm motor was embarrassing V8s at the drag strip. Driving it was a violent experience. Hit the throttle, and it didn't just move, it lunged forward. a solid wall of torque pushing you into the seat. It didn't scream, it roared. The V8s would wind up through gears, but the 300 simply shoved. Steady, brutal, unstoppable. At the drag strip, when Davidson popped the hood, crowds gathered in disbelief. Twin polished carburetors sat proudly on top, fuel lines glinting under the lights like exposed veins. It looked more like art than machinery, an act of defiance cast in iron and gasoline. For Davidson and his crew, it wasn't just about horsepower, it was about rebellion. It was about proving that the overlooked, overbuilt engine designed for dirty jobs could take on and beat the polished powerhouses built for glory. The Ford 300 didn't just work anymore, it hunted. And soon, it would do something even more dangerous. It would win. In the world of NASCAR's Sportsman Series, where money and muscle usually decided who won, a quiet rebellion was taking shape. Mechanics and small-town racers began turning to Ford's overlooked inline-six, the 300. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't roar like a V8, but it was tough, dependable, and cheaper to build. Then came 1973. Shorty Smith rolled his number 23 F100 onto the track, fitted with a carefully tuned Ford 300 that would soon rewrite expectations. It didn't dominate the straights with sheer speed. It conquered the corners. The raw torque from that six-cylinder engine pulled the truck out of turns like a locomotive, smooth, unstoppable, and brutally efficient. Fans called it genius. Ford's performance division called it a problem. While Ford was pouring millions into keeping their V8s on top, the success of a budget engine was humiliating. Orders came down swiftly from corporate headquarters. The rulebooks were rewritten. Suddenly, the 300 no longer met NASCAR's new homologation standards. It was banned without fanfare, erased from the track like it had never existed. The message from Dearborn was unmistakable. Winning was allowed, but only with the right engine. The betrayal didn't stop there. By the early 1980s, Ford's priorities shifted toward emissions and image. The Environmental Protection Agency's new regulations were cutting deep, and carburetors were dying off. Ford invested heavily in fuel injection, but only for their prized V8s, the humble inline-six that had carried half of America's farms, trucks, and small businesses for decades was left behind. The 300 was now obsolete in the eyes of the company that built it. A memo from Ford's headquarters sealed its fate. It would be phased out quietly. But not everyone at Ford was ready to surrender. Deep within the company's research division, a handful of engineers refused to let the legend die. They began working in secret on a prototype called Project Atlas, a turbocharged version of the 300 that produced over 400 lb-ft of torque while still managing 25 miles per gallon. The engine was overbuilt from birth. 7 main bearings, a forged crankshaft, a long-stroke design that turned boost into unstoppable power. Atlas could have redefined Ford's heavy-duty trucks. It could have ended the diesel race before it began. When the engineers finally presented Atlas to management, the reaction was ice cold. There was no applause, just a curt decision: no one wants a 6-cylinder Super Duty. Within days, every trace of Atlas disappeared. Test mules scrapped, documents shredded, and dyno charts destroyed. Officially, it never existed. When the last Ford 300 rolled off the production line in 1996, an era ended in silence. The God's Anvil engine, the one that refused to die, had finally been buried by the very company that owed it everything. But legends don't stay buried forever. Years later, in a frozen junkyard outside Detroit, a builder named Carter stumbled upon a milk crate full of old blueprints wrapped in plastic. Sketches, fuel maps, and compressor notes marked Atlas. Among them was a handwritten note from one of the original engineers: "She'll take 20 psi if you don't get stupid." Carter wasn't a corporate man. He was a backyard mechanic, the kind who could turn scrap metal into miracles. That winter, his workshop became a shrine. Using an old 300 block salvaged from a wrecked F350, he rebuilt the engine stronger than ever. Forged rods, custom pistons, every bolt upgraded. The twin carb setup from the racing days was replaced by a custom turbo manifold. Every evening, the sound of grinding metal echoed through the cold as Carter welded together the engine Ford had tried to erase. When spring came, the reborn 300 was ready. On the dyno, its torque graph didn't peak. It flattened into a wall, 412 lb-ft at just 2,000 revolutions per minute. On the street, it wasn't loud or flashy, but when he floored it, the truck lunged forward with terrifying force. That night, on an abandoned industrial road, Carter's creation came alive. The turbo whistled, the pavement trembled, and the ghost of Project Atlas roared again. This wasn't a drag run for trophies, it was a message, proof that Ford's dead engine had only been sleeping. Years later, former Ford engineer Frank Miller would recall in an interview, "We had the data. Better fuel economy, unbeatable durability, diesel-beating torque. But management killed it. They said it would cannibalize V8 sales. It was corporate suicide." He was right. As Ford protected its fragile ego, Dodge released the Cummins turbo diesel, the exact kind of engine Atlas could have been. It devoured the heavy-duty market, leaving Ford scrambling to catch up. And yet, even as the last 300 engines rusted away, its spirit refused to die. Backyard racers and small-town mechanics kept them alive, wrenching, tuning, and pushing those iron blocks to limits their creators never imagined. The 300 became a symbol, a middle finger to corporate politics. On dirt tracks and in truck pulls, it dominated quietly. Fans came to see V8s win, but went home talking about that six-cylinder Ford that refused to quit. And then came the whispers about a man named Arlen Jensen, a Ford engineer who supposedly smuggled the original Atlas designs out before the project was buried. Rumors say he built one in secret, a 300 that made over 600 lb-ft of torque and ran a 10.9-second quarter mile in a stock-looking F-150. When Ford found out, they threatened his pension and forced him to dismantle it. But not before the blueprints vanished again, copies hidden somewhere only he knew. Some say those plans still exist, passed between old mechanics and underground racers. There's even talk of a faded photograph, a dyno graph showing torque numbers that make diesel guys lose sleep. Maybe it's all myth. Or maybe somewhere, in a forgotten workshop, someone is building it again. Because legends like the Ford 300 don't really die. They just wait for the right hands to bring them back. And the question remains, if you had Arlen Jensen's blueprints, what would you build?